There was a night when Bill Gaither sat alone in a dark room and decided he was done, not resting, not slowing down, done, permanently, completely, without return. The man who had written "He Touched Me," who had built the Homecoming series into one of the most beloved movements in American gospel history, had made up his mind to walk away from all of it and never look back. But to understand what brought him to that place, you have to go back to the early 1990s, a period in Bill Gaither's life that almost no one talks about, and what you find there changes everything about how we see the man and the ministry he almost abandoned. If stories like this one matter to you, the real, private moments behind gospel music's greatest voices, subscribe to this channel right now. We tell these stories every week, and next, Mark Lowry is finally going to tell us the real reason he left the Gaither vocal band, in his own words, for the first time, with nothing held back. You do not want to miss that one. Bill Gaither is 90 years old. For more than 6 decades, his name has been synonymous with Southern gospel music in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. He wrote "Because He Lives" in 1971, a song born directly out of his own despair, and watched it become one of the most recorded hymns in modern Christian history. He and his wife Gloria built the Gaither vocal band from the ground up, and when they launched the Homecoming video series in 1991, they sparked a revival that brought together legends like Vestal Goodman, Jake Hess, and Howard and Vestal for recordings that millions of Americans still watch today on their living room televisions. Gloria Gaither is 84. She has been Bill's creative partner, his lyricist, and his closest companion through everything the ministry has faced. The two of them have written more than 700 songs together. But more than any song they ever wrote, it was one sentence Gloria spoke on one particular night that mattered most. By the early 1990s, Bill Gaither had spent nearly 30 years in full-time gospel music ministry, and the weight of those years had settled into something heavy and quiet. The Gaither vocal band had gone through several significant lineup changes through the late 1980s, and the music industry itself was shifting in ways that felt disorienting to someone who had built his life on a particular kind of gospel expression. Contemporary Christian music was pulling audiences in new directions. The traditional Southern gospel sound that Bill had grown up with, the sound he loved most deeply, was being called dated, irrelevant, a relic. What made it harder was that Bill was also grieving. Close friends in the gospel world had died. The community that had surrounded the early Homecoming years was thinning. He has spoken in interviews about periods of creative emptiness, moments when songs would not come, when the words dried up entirely. But what he has rarely described is what that emptiness felt like from the inside, not peaceful, not restful, but suffocating. A man who had built his entire identity around writing and singing songs about hope was sitting in the dark with no song left in him. The specific night in question came after a particularly painful stretch, a combination of personal loss, creative exhaustion, and a private crisis of faith that had been accumulating for longer than he had admitted to anyone, including himself. He had not told Gloria the full weight of what he was carrying. He sat alone after she had gone to bed, and in that quiet, he made his decision. He was going to stop. He was going to walk out of gospel music and not come back. What he did not know was that Gloria was not asleep. She came into the room and found him sitting there in the dark. She did not ask him what was wrong. She did not open with a scripture or a prayer or a carefully reasoned argument about his calling. She sat down beside him, and after a long silence, she said something that was so simple and so direct that it cut through everything he had built around himself. She said, "Bill, you don't have to perform for God." That was it. 7 words. What those 7 words did was name the thing he had never been able to name himself. That somewhere along the way, the joy of writing and singing had become entangled with the pressure of producing, of delivering, of being Bill Gaither for an audience that depended on him, and he had lost track of the difference between ministry and performance. He has described the moment in terms that suggest something close to physical relief, as if a door that had been sealed shut simply opened. He was not being asked to be extraordinary. He was not being told to try harder, to pray more, to get back on the stage and fake it until it returned. He was being given permission to be a man who was exhausted and grieving and uncertain, and to let that be enough for now. What happened next was not immediate. He did not walk back into the studio the following morning with songs pouring out of him. Recovery, real recovery, does not work that way. But something had shifted permanently. The decision to quit, which had felt so certain just hours before, had lost its hold on him, not because the pain had gone away, but because Gloria had sat down beside him in the dark and told him the pain did not disqualify him. Within the next year, the Homecoming video series would begin. The first recording session in April of 1991 brought together legends who had not shared a stage in years. And what happened in that room, by nearly every account of those who were present, felt less like a recording session and more like a reunion of people who had been waiting to come home. Bill Gaither stood in the middle of it and understood that this was what he was supposed to do. Not perform, but gather. Not dazzle, but remember. Not produce a product, but hold space for something that mattered. He chose to stay, and because he stayed, millions of people across 4 decades have had a place to go when they needed to remember what they believed. There is an image from that night that stays with you. Once you know the story, a man sitting alone in a dark room, having made his decision, certain it was over, and a woman walking in, not to argue with him, not to rescue him, but simply to sit beside him and tell him the truth. What that story tells us about Bill Gaither's legacy is not what most people would expect. We tend to think of legacies as built from the high moments, the songs that charted, the concerts that sold out, the homecoming videos that found their way into living rooms across the country. But Bill Gaither's legacy is also built from the night when there was almost nothing left, and one person spoke 7 words in the dark, and he decided to stay. That is what faith looks like when it is not on a stage. That is what a partnership built over decades actually means. And that is why the Homecoming series carries the warmth that it does. Because the man who created it knew, from personal experience, what it meant to be gathered back in when you had already started walking away. Gloria Gaither sat beside her husband in the dark and told him he did not have to perform for God. And everything that came after, every reunion, every recording, every moment when a voice cracked and someone in the audience reached for someone else's hand, everything came from that. Thank you for spending time with this story today. It is the kind of story that deserves to be told, and I am grateful you were here for it. If you are not subscribed yet, now is a perfect time. We share stories like this every week, and they are always free. And next, we are going to sit down with Mark Lowry as he finally tells us, in his own words and for the first time, the real reason he left the Gaither vocal band. And I promise, once you hear it, you will understand why he waited this long to say it.